In January 2025, US President Donald Trump ordered additional American forces to deploy on Diego Garcia, a remote island in the middle of the Indian Ocean with a US military base. This move was prompted by growing tensions with Iran and the Houthis in Yemen, and just 2 months later, Diego Garcia became a launching pad for a US bombing campaign against the Houthis. But the military buildup wasn't just about airstrikes. Behind the scenes, the US government used its positioning on Diego Garcia as a form of political leverage to pressure Iran during renewed nuclear negotiations. All of this underlines a very clear fact. Diego Garcia is one of the most strategically important military outposts for the United States, not just for operations in the Middle East, but for projecting power across the entire Indian Ocean. However, Diego Garcia is actually not part of the United States, but belongs to the United Kingdom, which leases the island to the US. But now this arrangement is changing. In April 2025, the British government began finalizing a historic deal to transfer sovereignty over Diego Garcia and the surrounding Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius in order to resolve a decades-long legal and moral dispute. Unsurprisingly, this decision has sparked an intense backlash in Britain and the US, as critics argue that transferring the islands will threaten British and American presence in the region. Later in May, the deal was signed, but to come into effect, it needs still to be ratified by both countries' parliaments. Some believe that the door is now open for powers like China to take advantage of this deal. But how did this tiny, isolated island become the center of a major geopolitical controversy? Why is the question of who Diego Garcia belongs to so sensitive? And could powers like China and India really use the situation to challenge the British-American military presence in the region? To find the answers, we need to untangle the tragic history of Diego Garcia, as well as the news coverage, which is much easier said than done. To effectively cut through the noise, Ground News is the perfect solution. With Ground News, we get a truly comprehensive overview of all the news sources that report on a specific topic from across the globe. Just take a look at this story about the UK finalizing the agreement over the Chagos Islands with Mauritius. I can immediately see that 39 news sources reported on the story, and it allows us to easily compare international headlines. This South African article, for example, focuses on the geopolitical consequences of the deal, while this British publication is highly critical of the costs it will inflict on the UK. But that's not all. Ground News also provides a lot of other extremely useful information, like how all these news sources lean politically, how credible the reporting is, and who actually owns them. My personal favorite is its blind spot feature, which helps me to burst my information bubble by highlighting stories that were mostly covered by one side of the political spectrum, like this story on Iran shrugging off the Trump administration's threats, which has mostly been reported by left-leaning sources. Ground News makes browsing the news much easier for me and can make it easier for you as well. Go to groundnews.com/politicswithpaint or use the QR code and you can get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan. Again, use groundnews.com/politicswithpaint in the description box or QR code to get this amazing discount. Thanks for Ground News for sponsoring this video, and now back to Diego Garcia. The Chagos Archipelago, of which Diego Garcia is the largest island of, was uninhabited for most of its history. Arab traders and fishermen from the Maldives may have visited the island earlier, but it wasn't until the 1500s that they were definitely discovered by the Portuguese. However, the islands were largely ignored by the colonial powers until the 1700s, when the French, having already taken over islands like Mauritius, took over the Chagos Archipelago and established coconut plantations there. To work those plantations, the French brought over slaves from Africa and Madagascar, and later laborers from South and Southeast Asia. Over time, these communities blended and formed a unique Creole culture known as the Chagossians, most of whom lived on Diego Garcia. The Chagos Islands then changed hands in 1814 after Napoleon was defeated. As a consequence, France was forced to cede most of its Indian Ocean territories to Britain, which included Mauritius and the Chagos Archipelago. Under the British, slavery was abolished and the Chagossians remained on the Chagos Islands, living off fishing and working on the local plantations. And in 1903, the British decided to merge the administration with the island of Mauritius. Things stayed relatively calm on the islands until Diego Garcia's strategic potential began to be recognized during the Cold War. As the Soviet Union expanded its influence across the old world, the United States and the UK began looking for a permanent, centrally located base in the Indian Ocean, and Diego Garcia emerged as the best location. So the US and the UK made a deal. The UK would provide the real estate, and the US the money and power to build and maintain a military base. However, there were two major problems. The first one was that the Chagos Islands were part of the British colony of Mauritius, which was destined to become independent. So, To keep the islands, the British decided to simply carve the islands out of Mauritius, which they did in 1965 by creating the British Indian Ocean Territory. Mauritius, under pressure and seeking independence, accepted the arrangement in return for £3 million, equivalent to around 50 million pounds or 66 million US dollars today, and a vague promise that the islands would be returned to Mauritius when they were no longer needed for defense. At the time, there was a fierce debate about the legality of this deal, as it violated the UN General Assembly Resolution 1514, which specifically prohibited colonial powers from separating and retaining parts of a colony before granting independence. Nonetheless, the deal finally allowed the US to sign a 50-year lease agreement with the UK in 1966, which handed over control of Diego Garcia to the Americans for building their military base. But there still was a second problem, the Chagossians. At this point, between 1,000 to 2,000 people called these islands their home, with most of them living on Diego Garcia, but they were seen by American and British planners as a security risk and inconvenience. To clear the way for the base, the UK began a campaign to push them out. Plantations were shut down and jobs eliminated, while families were told they were being sent to Mauritius or the Seychelles temporarily, but later denied re-entry. One of the most disturbing allegations was that the local authorities began to kill the islanders' dogs to pressure them to leave. The last of the Chagossians were deported in 1973. Meanwhile, the military transformation of Diego Garcia accelerated. By the 1980s, Diego Garcia had become a vital base in the American global military architecture and later played an instrumental role in numerous US military operations, including the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. However, the legal and moral consequences of the Chagos expulsion refused to go away, and the UK came under increasing pressure from three sides. Firstly, from the government of Mauritius, which claimed that it was illegally pressured by the UK to accept the separation of the Chagos Islands. Secondly, by exiled Chagossians, who began bringing lawsuits against the British government. And thirdly, by the United Nations, which applied legal, diplomatic and moral pressure on the UK for several years to compel it to return the islands to Mauritius. Nonetheless, the UK was trying as hard as it could to resist the pressure. In 2010, for example, they declared a maritime protection zone around the archipelago officially to protect the local environment. Sounds great, but it forbade any economic activity, including fishing in the area, which basically made resettling the islands impossible. However, pressure was only increasing. In 2015, an arbitral tribunal ruled that this protection zone was illegal under international law, and in 2019, the International Court of Justice gave an advisory opinion that the separation of the Chagos Islands from Mauritius was unlawful and that the UK had to end the colonial administration as soon as possible. Britain initially refused to budge, but it became clear that its position was becoming diplomatically unsustainable. This was clearly demonstrated in 2022 when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. The UK vehemently opposed Russian actions on the basis of international law, but its control of the Chagos Islands was undermining its credibility. So finally, the UK and Mauritius announced a joint agreement that would see Britain formally recognize Mauritian sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago. However, the deal would allow Britain to retain control of Diego Garcia under Mauritian sovereignty of 99 years, with the option to extend. Mauritius, in turn, would be allowed to resettle the Chagossians on the outer islands, but not on Diego Garcia, which will remain under US control through the Anglo-American lease agreement. The American reaction to this was mixed. The Biden administration supported the agreement, while the following Trump administration initially opposed it. But it seems that Trump has since dropped his opposition to the deal for now, as his administration believes that it won't threaten the existence of the US military base on Diego Garcia. However, there is still fierce opposition to this plan in Britain, because many see this deal as a betrayal not just of British strategic interests, but of the wider Western alliance. They also fear that it sets a dangerous precedent for other territorial disputes the UK has, such as Cyprus, Gibraltar or the Falklands. I actually made videos on the latter two, you could watch them later. And then there's also the enormous costs that it would involve, which the government estimates to be around £3.4 billion or $4.6 billion US in total. There are even some Chagossians who are against it and would prefer either independence or self-rule under the British. In May 2025, the UK and Mauritius finally announced that they signed the deal, but due to the massive opposition in the UK, it's still unclear whether it will be pushed through Parliament successfully. Which brings us to the situation we have at the release of this video. When looking at this dispute, its controversial history, and the immense pressure coming from three sides on the United Kingdom, it's easy to understand why the UK government wants to make a deal with Mauritius. But what about the US? Why did both the Biden and Trump administrations signal that they are fine with this deal? Well, it seems that Washington is fairly certain that the deal will have little to no downsides regarding the security and functionality of Diego Garcia, partly because they were consulted during the creation of the deal. It will allow the UK to keep control of Diego Garcia for at least 99 years, so the US will have little problems prolonging the lease of Diego Garcia for the foreseeable future, which will come up again for extension in 2036. At the same time, there are a number of upsides. For one, it will end most discussions around the legality of UK and US control of Diego Garcia. For another, it would give the US a very long time window to build a working relationship with Mauritius. The Biden administration in particular was very sympathetic to the Mauritian cause and supported the negotiations, and the Trump administration now seems willing to build upon these foundations to make Mauritius a reliable partner in the Indian Ocean for the long term. But as already mentioned, many in the UK are not thrilled about that, because they will have to cover the costs of the deal and also lose a significant chunk of the exclusive economic zone along with the islands. Therefore, it's not surprising that there's so much opposition to the deal, and we could see it fall through in the UK Parliament, which still needs to ratify it. But whether the deal is pushed through or not, Mauritius is now surely on the radar of all the region's rising powers, like China and India, who are also trying to increase their influence in Mauritius. So could this be a real threat to the American presence in the Indian Ocean? When it comes to China, Beijing has long expressed interests in the Indian Ocean. It has established a military base in Djibouti, financed ports in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, and strengthened maritime links with East Africa. And with Mauritius specifically, it has intensified economic cooperation and supported Mauritian claims in the United Nations. Now, it's unlikely that China will be able to influence Mauritius to such a degree that it would try to kick out the Americans once it's legally possible. However, some have suggested that China could eventually seek a military base in the Chagos Archipelago on their own. To be fair, aside from Diego Garcia, very few of the other islands are suitable for that, and those that are also likely candidates for Chagossian resettlement. But China does have experience when it comes to expanding islands in the South China Sea, which they could apply to some of the shallow banks and reefs in the area to create a workable island, and that would be a nightmare for the US. But there is another actor worth mentioning here that is often overlooked: India, which is arguably the most influential foreign country in Mauritius. In addition to its strong economic connections and growing security cooperation, India also shares deep cultural ties with the island nation. Close to 50% of Mauritius' population is Hindu, and the vast majority are at least partially of Indian descent. This gives India a lot of soft power, which it can wield to its advantage. Right now, this does not really represent a threat to the American presence on Diego Garcia, as relations between India and the US are stable, and they even worked on increasing security cooperation in the Indian Ocean through organizations like the Quad. However, it's important to remember that the geopolitical system is always in flux, and while they seem to have good relations right now, India and the US don't see eye to eye on every single issue. There are significant disagreements that could eventually lead to a worsening of relations. For example, India's partnerships with countries like Russia and Iran. Recently, there was even a major diplomatic crisis after the United States accused an Indian government agent of conspiring to assassinate a prominent Sikh separatist leader in New York, something I made a video on a while ago. Just like China, India has its own interests in the Indian Ocean, and those are not guaranteed to always align with the US and its Western allies. Therefore, it is possible that somewhere down the line, India could start viewing the American presence on Diego Garcia as a problem and use its influence in Mauritius to perhaps get them out. But as of right now, this is just speculation. Nobody knows what the future holds for Diego Garcia and the Chagos Islands, but one thing is certain: they are no longer just a footnote in history. Instead, these islands are slowly becoming a geopolitical frontline between the powers of the Indian Ocean. A big thank you to my patrons and channel members, and here are some other videos you might find interesting. Why not check them out? I'll see you in the next one. Bye.